Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Mike Maynard, the CEO of Napier Group. It's a UK-based PR and marketing firm that focuses heavily on B2B technology companies across Europe. Welcome, Mike. We're happy to have you.
Hi, Neeta. Great to be on the podcast. Thank you.
For our audience, we have a few different topics to cover. We wanted to have you on the show so that we could talk about M&A because you have some interesting experience yourself as well as through your client work. And then we were also going to talk about crisis communications.
Yeah, it's an ambitious agenda, but let's go for it.
We'll start then by talking about M&A. It's a topic that we discuss often here on the podcast. I thought you had a really interesting perspective on it, given that you're an engineer and ended up as a marketer. You acquired your agency just before the dot-com crash, and it focuses on tech. I know you've grown it into greater success through acquisitions over the year and through a strong client base. Will you tell us a little bit about what your own personal M&A experience was like and some of the lessons learned?
Many years ago, I did an MBA, and our lecturer in finance actually he was a really witty, funny guy. He used to say, "You're doing this all wrong. What you need to do is you need to open a laundrette." And all sat back. This guy's finally gone crazy. And he said, "Trust me, you're all going to go off and do these things." And I went to do marketing and some other people went in management consulting. He said, "There's lots of smart people there. I don't want to offend you, but they're smarter than you. Laundrettes, not so much. Go and open something where there's not competition." So I listened to that and then decided to buy a marketing agency, which is a bad idea. It's one of the most crowded sectors in the UK and US. There's way more marketing agencies than we need. So it's a really tough market. And then to compound that, as you say, I managed to buy a technology agency literally a couple of weeks before the dot-com crash, which was not the best timing.
What's impressive about that, though, and there might be some benefits, honestly, to starting in a tougher environment, in a tougher economy, it probably forced some real choices on your part. I wonder, did some of that efficiency actually get built into how you've grown this business?
That's a really interesting question. My honest view is there's pros and cons of starting in a tougher market and in a good market. I'd rather start in a good market and have a great time than start in a tough market.
Sure.
To me, that tough market, yes, you get a lot of scars and you learn a lot very quickly. To say it's better or worse is completely wrong. It's different. So we did some things that really changed how the agency was built. We're really good at retaining clients and we understand clients. We work really hard to retain them and everybody really cares about keeping clients happy. More so, frankly, than other agencies. All agencies care to some extent. Absolutely. It's job one to make sure that clients are happy. So client retention is really good. Actually, in terms of investing money, taking risks, trying to grow the business, probably not so good over the years. And I think we're much better now, but I think we were overly cautious. We've been really bruised and battered by literally what could have killed the agency within months of it starting and tended to be overcautious for a number of years. And really, I think that scarred us. So there's definitely some good things. We've definitely built the agency as an agency that works with long-term clients. We do relatively few projects. We will do projects with clients, but only if we think it will lead to a retainer. And then actually what we've seen is that, yeah, that's done well in terms of retaining the business and growing organically, but we're not pulling in as many new clients as maybe some other agencies would.
Given that you have experience in M&A yourself, how has that affected or influenced your perspective when you work with clients? You've had a number of different clients that have gone through significant M&A activity, often as acquirers. And one of the clients you were telling me had acquired something like 30 acquisitions over a decade, which is amazing. How has that shaped how you think about M&A?
The client you mentioned was probably around $150 million when we started working with them 30-something years ago. They're now 10 billion, basically. Yeah, wow. They've grown incredibly, and both through organic and through acquisition. It's really interesting having gone through acquisitions at a very different scale. When it comes to M&A, really the problems are all the same. And most of the problems are about people. We can talk directly with our clients and they might be acquiring a 1,000-person business or bigger, but actually a lot of the problems of integrating people and processes and cultures, they're the same as when we buy an agency that's maybe 10 people. I think there's a lot of similarities. We can have a lot of empathy for the problems. The problems sound like they should be straightforward. There's somebody who's not happy because of this, or there's somebody who wants to do this because they've always done it that way. The acquiring company just says, no, move on. You've been acquired. In reality, that conversation is way harder than it sounds in theory. So I think we build empathy. I think we build an understanding and a level of admiration as well, where things go well with acquisitions. I think that requires a lot of effort and thought. And so it almost means that because we've got that experience, we're actually looking at, oh, wow, you did that? That's really cool. And that worked well. And that's amazing. So you get real enthusiasm about it.
Do you find then that the integration planning is the differentiator when it comes to successful acquisitions?
Planning is really important. Process is really important. Actually sticking to your guns is probably the most important thing. Different companies acquire in different ways. If you have a process and it works, then that's something you need to keep doing. You don't want to start changing things for different companies that you're acquiring. It's about consistency and finding what works for you. And that's interesting because if people are listening and they've not been involved in M&A and they want to start, that's really tough. My first acquisition was Napier, which to some extent was quite controlled because we had previous owners wanting to retire and there was a controlled handover. But my next acquisition was fairly small, and it was to learn more than to necessarily get a great acquisition. As it turned out, the acquisition was pretty good. Small, not change the world kind of levels, but about 4 people. It made a big difference. Got some wonderful people in the business, still in contact with the previous owner, who's an amazing guy. So it was really positive. I think start small is always a good approach.
Are there any lessons on the client side in terms of where you've seen acquisitions improve over time, meaning the muscle of acquiring an integration?
I think the client that made the acquisitions
Yes.
got really good at it.
Yeah.
They got really good at it. I'm sure they'd be the first to say there were still issues with some of the later ones, but they had that process. They understood what they were going to do. And they pretty much came in and said, this is what's going to happen. They had real clarity, which I think is a problem where people are acquiring, they don't really want to upset the team that they're acquiring. They try and be nice, they try and be flexible. And sometimes they come across as not having a plan, even if they do, because they're trying to accommodate people. Whereas I think going in and going, this is how it works. This is the best way. We've done it 30 times. You've never done it before. This is how it's going to happen. Really good. And I think that having that confidence, that clarity really helps. Don't get me wrong. Not everybody's going to stay after an acquisition. People are going to leave and you're going to lose people. But I think it's far better to have people leaving because they don't buy into the company that's acquired them. They don't see the benefit, rather than have people who leave because they're just not sure what's going to happen. That seems to me to be a real waste.
What is your take on how comms and marketing play into successful acquisitions? I know you have a point of view on this. I don't think it gets enough attention when it comes to M&A.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I think you've got to be pretty direct about what you're doing and why you're doing it to your audience. And you've got to have a view as to how you're going to handle those brands. We started off in our first acquisition. I can tell you, our first acquisition, we acquired a company called Peter Bush Communications. Peter obviously was the founder of Peter Bush Communications. The brand was good. The agency was relatively small, but the brand was superb. People knew who Peter was. They loved him. They loved the team. We kept that brand going for a while. And eventually I looked at it and I summoned up this courage, picked up the phone to Peter and I said, I'm really sorry, Peter. I've got to tell you, we've decided that we're going to merge Peter Bush into Napier. You're going to be Napier now. And I waited for the answer to be, you're a complete idiot, all this brand equity. And Peter just said, I've been waiting for this call for a really long time. I don't know why you didn't do it earlier. And I think sometimes you can try and overthink things. And actually, it's about communicating. So brand matters. And I think being clear that you're acquiring a brand, the reasons you're acquiring a brand, but also being clear as to what the way forward is. And the way forward is to effectively absorb that company into your brand. You should do that sooner rather than later. Don't necessarily mean immediately, but certainly sooner. I think you should be really clear on that. And again, it comes with clarity. If you think about the customers of the brand you've acquired, they're going to wonder what happens, what it means to them. So you need to tell them. You need to be really clear rather than go, it's fine, nothing's going to change. That's often the message with an acquisition. And I think that's a terrible message because the customers are going, no, you've paid money for this as a reason. Things are going to change.
Yeah, it feels authentic or maybe even dishonest to the customer base. But
Absolutely.
That's an interesting example too, because I'm assuming you mentioned it was a smaller firm with strong brand recognition. So was part of your thinking that you were worried about diminishing that value and having an adverse effect on your business now that you owned it? What was some of the thinking around why to delay or why to move forward with that?
The brand was making good money in terms of the business. It was solid. It was making money, had a reputation. It could certainly attract clients.
Hmm.
And we were scared of losing that by bringing it into Napier. And obviously what we were doing was we weren't really buying a brand. Talk about buying a brand. You're not buying a brand. You're buying the team, the culture, the approach. All of that contributes to making up the brand. But the brand itself generally isn't that important, particularly in business to business. And so I think we misunderstood. I thought the brand was the name, but the brand was the culture and what had been created. The brand wasn't Peter Bush's name above the door. The brand was what Peter had created in the business. By taking that in a sympathetic way, we could get some of those good bits about the brand absorbed across the rest of Napier and make the whole company better.
Do you find that those lessons carry across larger firms too, looking back at your client base or companies you've worked with?
Yeah, for sure. We work particularly with tech companies, and quite often a tech company acquisition is around a particular area of technology, of expertise or a product. In that case, the value again is in the product rather than necessarily in the brand. There are a few brands that are very strong and have been acquired and maintained, but in general, if you look at the tech world, where the acquisitions are good, you almost forget about the acquisition because the new company takes on that product and maybe they've got more resources, more money, and they actually push it harder. They generate even more momentum. They're more successful than the company they acquired. And so suddenly, magically, like this little bit of success here becomes an even bigger bit of success. And who is it? Is it the acquiring company? Is it the acquiree? No, it's both of them working together. And I think that's the exciting thing about M&A is that you can bring two businesses together and make them more than 1+1. Now, of course, the problem is when it goes wrong, you then have acquisitions where you bring two businesses together and actually the value is less than the original businesses. That is a big challenge, and that does happen. I think a lot of the time, that's really down to not having thought through what you're going to do and not having that crisp, clear execution as to how you're going to do it.
Microchip stands out among your experiences. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the communications challenges and opportunities that presented?
Yeah, Microchip bought a few people, but fairly recently they made two very large acquisitions. One was Atmel and one was Microsemi. And to me, they were super challenging for Microchip. Atmel because it was a competitor, a very direct competitor. And I think people looked at it and went, you're not going to keep both sides of the business running. One's going to win, one's going to lose. That didn't happen. Microchip said, we get people need choice. We get people pick this particular product family for these reasons, this particular product family for these reasons. They obviously have areas of focus. But if you're a customer of either company, you don't feel like you've been let down by that acquisition. You don't feel that the other company's won and those products are being promoted. I think they did an amazing job of taking a competitor, bringing the products in and frankly, doing a better job with those products than the competitor did. So that's a really interesting case study. The other one was Microsemi, somewhat different because Microchip bought Microsemi and fundamentally, most of what Microsemi did was different to Microchip. Microchip had to bring those products into Microchip and get people to associate Microchip with those products. And there, to be honest, they've invested some money. They've really thought about the fact of their customers still thinking maybe it's Microsemi. And they've really worked to change that perception. They've been genuinely honest. They were the bigger company. They could have easily said, look, we're a bigger company. This is a smaller company. We just bring all the products in. Everybody believes us. It's going to work. But actually, they said people might have concerns. People might struggle with some of the brands. Some of the brands had come from other brands. They'd been Microsemi acquisitions. So there was potentially multiple stage acquisitions. And I think Microchip was just brutally honest with, we're going to have to do some work here to associate the Microchip brand with these product categories. And as it turns out, they did a great job. I think it's been really positive. Hopefully, we've been a part of that and really helped them establish reputations in those markets. They've taken business areas and grown them faster than before. Some of Microchip's resource and size has probably helped that. But they've done an incredible job. And I think through being perhaps a little bit humble, there are going to be issues. certainly down to having a lot of experience. I think both of these acquisitions would be difficult as their first acquisition. And they've done an amazing job in both cases. If you talk to the engineers that buy these products, most of them would be like, yeah, we buy Microchip. Of course, what was that brand before? I can't remember. It was quite good, but that's amazing. I think Microchip has done a great job and they execute really well. They have a real focus. They have distinct stages that they go through the acquisition, and they know what's going to happen. Not only have a lot of people stayed from those acquisitions, but I think a lot of people are happier now at Microchip than they were before. And I'm pretty sure most companies, the employees, when they get told they're going to be acquired, immediately the thought is it's not going to be as good. And I think actually creating an environment where people enjoy working, they want to stay, they feel valued, that's another success that Microchip's brought to those acquisitions.
This is a great example. Thank you for sharing about Microchip. The through line to me sounds like they were very appropriately focused on customers, even though they had two different strategic goals in those acquisitions, which makes a lot of sense. Is that fair to say? I think that's a really helpful takeaway, if so.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Neeta. So you can buy a competitor, for example, and just kill the products and assume people will come to you.
Yeah.
That's not really thinking about the customers. Like customers have invested time, they've invested engineering effort. Microchip is a very customer-focused company. I've not really thought about it this way, but that's probably one of their secrets about doing great acquisitions is they see it from the customer point of view.
I think it makes a lot of sense because marketers often talk about customer focus when it comes to brand. Other departments tend to find that it feels fluffy or unserious. But at the end of the day, the real question is we are selling a widget, a service, whatever to someone. They are the determining factor of the choices we make. Some companies, I think, lose sight of that. So I know it's easy to say, but harder to implement.
And having been an engineer and actually being a customer of Microchip a long time ago, I think people can get too focused on the CFO view, the efficiency, the cost savings and things like that.
The spreadsheets, yes.
Yeah. And honestly, if you buy a company to save a little bit of cost, that's the dullest thing in the world. If you buy a company to grow sales and get more customers and to build a bigger business, that's really exciting. And people should sometimes focus on what is really the more exciting thing rather than what's portrayed as the standard acquisition thing about efficiencies and removing duplication.
I agree with you. I find that the best CFOs I know are very customer focused, which is not something you hear often from the finance department, but it is a good sign when the finance folks are asking you what the customer impact is or what the implications are.
Yeah, for sure. I say it's a CFO thing to focus just on efficiency.
Yeah, there are those too, for sure.
There's quite a few. We've all met them, but you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean university CFOs are not visionary. Having that vision, that view of how you're going to make things better, that's really important.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would share on M&A before we switch gears?
I think the last thing I'd share is from experience, there's two ways to get success or failure in M&A. And one of them is financial and to have an acquisition that grows and produces revenue. And the other, I'd say, is more cultural, and particularly for small business, a lot of that is around how the owner making the acquisition experiences that acquisition, how the people they acquire behave. And I think those two things are very different. It's hard to predict how smoothly that emotional acquisition is going to be. Those feelings, where people are going to be, how supportive they are. One of the things I'd say is that my best financial acquisition was one of the worst in terms of stress by far. We had all sorts of issues that caused us all sorts of problems. And some of the best, I mean, my most recent one, in terms of finances, disappointing. We were trying to take an opportunity with a client, as it turned out, nothing to do with the acquisition or anything else. The client basically disappeared. So we lost revenue. It was disappointing. But in terms of the people and the previous owner who sold to me, great relationship. He's still out there. I know that when he's talking to people, he's saying, go to Napier. So there's a bit of an intangible benefit there that even if the financial side didn't quite work out, there's still some good there. So I think there's always good and bad in acquisitions. It's just hard to predict where they're going to go.
That's a helpful takeaway. And maybe it's also resiliency on the part of the acquirer in terms of making the most of it if it didn't go according to plan, right? So
definitely. Resiliency is an important characteristic, I think.
That's great. Thank you. I know it's not maybe the topic that you talk about as much, but we talk a lot about M&A here. Thanks for sharing your perspective. One of the other areas that I thought would be interesting for us to discuss based on your work is brand equity and reputation management. You have helped a lot of different companies. Can you maybe take us through one of the examples of how you've helped a company navigate a sticky situation when it comes to reputation management?
It's really interesting. I think how you navigate issues around reputational management and crisis has much less to do with the actual crisis itself and much more to do with what you do previously and how you build that brand. Where you see people building brands that fundamentally are authentic and honest, and they're clearly trying to do the right thing. They're trying to win customers because they make great products. They're trying to understand the needs of the market, meet the needs of the market. And yeah, they get it wrong. Companies get it wrong. But customers and in our B2B audience, they tend to be professionals, and particularly for us professional engineers, they actually do get a feel as to whether a company is generally what you might crudely call a good company or a bad company. And I think that's super important, because when it comes to a crisis, quite often there's a lot going on that's very hard to control. Now, in B2B, we don't necessarily have a lot of crises. Most B2B companies carry on through, and there's the odd issue, but nothing's very major. But every so often you'll come across something that causes a real big problem. We had one client who was literally raided by the SWAT team at 7 a.m, guns, everything. And
Wow.
there were photos as well. As it turns out, and this sounds incredible, the client was basically a victim of mistaken identity. Someone had misunderstood their part numbering scheme, and they'd shipped a product out that was entirely able to be shipped out, no military use, all fine. But because of, I think it was a couple of letters on the part number that people got confused over, it was decided that maybe this was a controlled product. And as it turns out, it wasn't. They were absolutely obeying the law. There were no issues. One of my interesting findings with B2B crises is that all too often, the actual company at the center of it is not at fault. And I think companies sitting there complaining they're not at fault is the worst response to take.
Yeah, agreed.
We had one client who was found back in the days of the Iraq War to be used in Iraqi IED devices, roadside bombs. That response was as simple as talking to the American State Department and saying, we did not export this. We know we didn't. How many people do you need to help you find out who did it? I can't really give any details, but they literally put people tracking down where these components were sold. They were obviously sold through many middlemen, and they found the person who eventually went to jail. I think that's really interesting that the client never got any credit for it. But actually, I think because of their really proactive response, they didn't get a lot of criticism. Now we're seeing American companies having stories about their products being found in Russian missiles. And I think it's another similar issue. The playbook for most of the electronics companies that are doing this is exactly the same. We'll find out who's shipping these products and we'll help you stop it. These companies are not being proactive. If anyone's seen some of these stories, people open up a Russian missile, they find components, they've got logos of American companies. A lot of these parts are made in Russia that are counterfeit, and some of them don't work. So that's possibly why the missile hasn't actually hit a target. And then secondly, I can't say hand on heart, I know for sure that nobody is exporting this stuff illegally, but I'm pretty sure that none of our clients are, because I know the extent they go through to really track these products to make sure they don't go. The issue is when people buy parts, they buy too many, maybe they sell them on the grey market. They shouldn't be doing that, but maybe they feel they sell them to a reputable buyer who then sells it on and sells it on. And it actually gets away from being something that's definitely within the law to something prepared to work at the edges of the law in another country with different regulations. And I think B2B crises are really tricky because they're really complex.
There's so much in this. First of all, export controls are incredibly important, and both the US government and your government take that very seriously. So there is a high standard for a reason, which I'm sure we both agree on. But you're also right that there's some nuance in there. There are real questions about supply chain. Is it a failure on our part? Did someone else take advantage of this? Were we doing something that was a high risk behavior we shouldn't have been doing? Or is it unintentional? We did all the right things, but we may still suffer reputational risk or damage, or worse. Some of these laws, as you mentioned, more than a SWAT team, it could be jail time for executives or other people at the company. There are very serious consequences to some of this. There is so much here. Do you think, is it tech specifically? Is it B2B generally that has to really be thinking about the worst case scenarios when it comes to something like this in a way that's maybe different from other sectors? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. It is particularly tech because warfare is very tech driven. Tech's got to understand that there always is that opportunity for a problem. The good thing is, I think journalists understand the export controls. They know how export controls work. And they know that if you're a major company, you are not going to be bypassing those export controls because you will get caught. And that's a really good thing. And if you get caught, people will go to jail. There's all these areas on the edge where somebody does something that then passes your product on, or maybe there's a counterfeit product that isn't actually yours, but it's got your logo on it. Absolutely. Tech companies need to be aware this is going to happen. What's been happening, particularly with electronic components appearing in Russian munitions, tech companies are very switched onto it now. They understand the problem. And that's good. The good thing is they're trying super hard. They're not following the letter of the law. They're going beyond the letter of the law and they're being more careful because they care about their reputation. And if you want to give one example where reputation being important actually is good for the world, this is it. Tech companies are working super hard to do everything they can and to make sure that their components don't fall into the wrong hands. I think that's such a positive thing. And I wish there were more people out there actually passing on that message, because I think it is positive news for the whole world.
It's a really important issue, whether it's export controls or sanctions. These are serious policies with massive geopolitical implications. So that's not something to take lightly. Based on your experiences with clients, if a company is going through a really tough situation like this, and let's assume only good intent and that it's inadvertent, whatever has happened, how do you help your clients in terms of thinking through what they need to do from immediate action to a long-term plan, given the fact that, as you mentioned before, a lot of this is also having strong operating rules and risk management and a strong communication strategy? How would you advise someone to work through a situation like this if it arises?
I remember a long time ago in a lecture about PR, somebody said, what's the right PR strategy for an oil spill? And students would come up with PR strategies. And the guy just said, clean the oil. The one thing you can do where there's a crisis, irrespective of whether it's your fault or not, fault doesn't matter in this situation, fix the problem.
Yeah.
And that's job number one. And then second, be honest. We've seen clients with the huge majority of components have their brand on in Russian munitions are fake. They know they're fake, but there are one or two that aren't. Don't just go on about the fake. Just be honest. There are some that have got through. This is the problem. We're doing this to fix it. And I think once companies get really clear about that, they then come across as being genuinely authentic and caring about fixing the problem. Usually the public can accept that there's been problems. The public wants to know what you're going to do to fix it. What happened in the past, nothing can change. And there are probably some crises you never recover from. But having said that, I think a lot of crises in B2B, they're nuanced, they're complicated. Very rarely you're going to see a B2B business deliberately doing something wrong. And so be honest, explain what's happened. If it's your fault, say it's your fault, and then say how you're going to fix it and move forward. And I think the problem that people have when they try to not talk about what happened and not be honest and not be transparent is they're stuck in the past, always haggling over what actually happened. You have to draw a line and move forward and fix things. Then don't do anything wrong. That's my third bit of advice. If you're a B2B business, your brand is worth more than it's going to cost you if you do something wrong and get caught, and you probably will get caught.
That's great advice too, is take the calculus of if this comes to light, are you going to be okay with the choices you made?
Absolutely.
Very wise. Any other advice that you'd provide?
I think the last bit of advice is you will get through it. Whenever a B2B business has a crisis, and particularly because they're so rare, it feels really bad. It feels like a disaster. If you handle it well, if you fix the problem, if you're honest, you will get through it. And I'm not going to say it's going to be a pleasant experience, but it will get better. It's probably not going to be as bad as you think in a year's time. So I do think there's a lot of optimism for B2B businesses. And where you've built a brand that really has significant trust and has real credibility and you're prepared to be authentic, I think you've got a lot there that's going to hold you through crises, even if you have made some mistakes. I think people will forgive them. Do remember you'll get through it. Just work through it. Don't think it's the end of the world.
You just sparked another question. What is your advice then for companies when it comes to a strong communication strategy that would better enable you to navigate a crisis if that arises?
Clarity of communication and not trying to mislead customers. I don't want to say being truthful because that sounds a bit crass. Everyone wants to present their product in the best light. Absolutely, you should do that. But don't mislead customers. Be the brand that people feel that, yeah, you're great salespeople, but we like you and trust you. And I think that's the way to look at it, is to be positive, but to not try and mislead people. Build that trust, because the more trust you can build, the more customers you're going to have coming to you and the more supporters you've got.
One of the topics that caught my eye when we were first introduced was around the self-directed buyer journey. It's a huge shift in B2B that I know you've been really focused on. We have been too. How do you think about that? You had a great example that I thought really crystallized a lot of this with a baggage handling company that you have worked with. I wonder if you can take us through it, because I thought it was a really interesting way of thinking through a long sales cycle with very limited points of influence and opportunity that was still successful for the folks that you were working with. Will you share that story?
Yeah, sure. We worked for a long time with a company that made baggage handling systems for airport. When your bag gets taken away from you when you check in, it gets moved magically around the airport, hopefully, and appears at the plane, and then the other end comes out of the plane and appears for you to collect it. Now, if you're selling those systems, it's fantastic. These systems are incredibly expensive. Companies are selling maybe one or two a year. But the problem is, who do you sell them to? The answer is somebody who's just built an airport terminal, because that's when you need a baggage handling system. If you've already got an airport terminal built, you don't need a baggage handling system because you've got it there. And that's not entirely true. There are some arguments, there's some upgrades going on and stuff. Fundamentally, you're building a terminal. They sold into, for example, the terminal in Munich. And they said, yeah, that was quite a tricky sales cycle. That was a little bit over 20 years. And you think about trying to maintain interest over 20 years in a system or in a purchase where you've got an airport that's being built. You've probably got some sort of regional or even national governments worrying about the airport and interfering in the airport. You've got consultants who tell you what baggage handling system to buy. You've got companies where you outsource the building of the terminal. And if they don't build a terminal where your baggage handling system fits, it's incredibly difficult to sell because you can't fit it in. It really is a 20-year sales cycle, because if the spec of the building is wrong, chances are it won't meet what you need for your baggage handling system to perform best. Therefore, someone else will be bought as the baggage handling system. And it comes down to this ultimately influencing the tender. And I think, again, this is probably a whole other podcast, and it's really complex, but don't just think about the sales process moving more to marketing. What marketing should be doing is addressing people prior to that sales process. Yeah. In large purchases where you have tenders, I think that's already accepted. People understand to get it written around your product. You'll be the one that's chosen because your product will be the best fit. Getting people to think in the same way that you think about the product category and the devices you make is the way for marketing to go. And so I think influencing people way prior to that. And we see that quite a lot, particularly in the semiconductor world, where people have specific ways of solving problems. And quite often different vendors have different approaches. We actually see vendors going out and selling their philosophy because that's what's going to win them the business when people choose a product.
Yeah, that's why this is such a great example to me, because while the 20-year sales cycle, probably people are having a heart attack hearing that, but it's a perfect encapsulation of even the challenges of an 18-month deal or a 2-year deal, which is obviously very common in B2B, particularly in tech. It's also a great segue into your philosophy and views on what account-based marketing really is and should look like. And the other thing that I thought was so interesting about this example is it's also one where you can't rely on a salesperson or a sales team to solve this problem. It is a holistic challenge for your organization, the entire company, from product to operations to installation, maintenance, as well as go to market. That's why I think it's such a good example. You've worked with such a wide range of companies. What do you think that high performance organizations do differently from average performers?
Such a good question. I think the really interesting thing is that high performance organizations don't last forever. So what you need to do to form a high performance organization today is different to what you need to do tomorrow. And so I think what high performance organizations are doing is they're continually looking for what actually makes the difference. And they're very prepared to accept that what they did yesterday maybe isn't right today. So I don't think there's a secret. I don't think there's anything you can say that if you do this, you're always going to be high performance. But I think actually it's being able to really get what you do matched to the time that you do it. Timing is everything. If you want some advice, don't buy a technology agency 3 weeks before the .com crash.
That is a great answer. I think it's a very interesting answer to the question. This is why I ask this question. I always get good answers. Thank you so much, Mike. We really appreciated having you.
Thank you, Neeta. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show, give us a rating, or leave us a review. It helps other listeners find us, and we really appreciate your support. You can also catch full videos and highlights on our YouTube channel.